Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for making time to participate in this conversation, really, about the role of storytelling and tourism. I just wanted to set it in a broader context in a way. I'm very aware that Africa is the world's most diverse continent. Certainly it is now, with the range of different ethnic groups and the languages which are spoken in the continent. And for me, the excitement of Africa is largely about its people rather than about its wildlife. So the question I wanted to try and focus on today is, what is the role of tourism in sharing knowledge about the many different peoples who live in Africa, and how is that best done? And one of the ways it's obviously done is through storytelling. Now, I'm going to let you introduce yourselves, but I just want to say one thing about the first person I'm going to ask this question of, which is Doroha, which is that you're based down in Cape Town, in an area which was once populated almost entirely by your antecedents. It's very much where your community came from. And I just wanted you to tell me a little bit, say something about who you are first, maybe, Doroha, but then perhaps just tell me about Table Mountain, because I think it's a really good way in to the conversation we want to have this afternoon.
Yeah, no, basically, Gangans, thank you so much for the opportunity. So if we're going to say in Khoikhoi, I'm going to say Titonske at Toroha. My name is Toroha, and I am based in a place that today is called Cape Town, but it had a name, Khoikhoi. It's this most beautiful clicks, and it sort of also has a name, a meaning. It means where the clouds gather. Interestingly enough, if I talk about Table Mountain and this name Khoikhoi, where the clouds gather, is that at times when you are in Khoikhoi, Cape Town, you can look to the mountain and you will actually see the clouds gathering. And there's something so profound when you know this language, this origin language, that this name Khoikhoi, where the clouds gather, come from. Storytelling is very important, you know, in terms of understanding a people, and those stories are often, you know, you can't share them in any other languages. And so the Table Mountain had a Khoikhoi name, Uri Kwacha, Uri Kwacha. And I remember before I went onto Table Mountain and not knowing Khoikhoi, I would just be on this mountain and call it Table Mountain. Later on, my journey would be me reconnecting with my ancestral languages and hearing this story of this mountain, Uri Kwacha. And it means where the ocean rises, where the ocean explodes. And there's something magical that happens when you then find yourself on that mountain, knowing the language, knowing the story of the mountain, then looking down at the waters. And you literally have this goosebumps because you're like, oh my word, this water is literally rising up from the mountain. And I think for me, that story is you know, I never looked at Urikwaha or Table Mountain the same again after that story. And I think storytelling is really just, you know, in the language of a place, it just adds so much to that place. Yeah.
Doroha, I've been to Cape Town about 25 times. I've never been up Table Mountain, but what you've just said about it has made me really want to go up there. But I want to go up there with you or someone from your group as my guide, so that I understand its cultural significance. Because to call it a table is a very European thing to do, kind of turn it into a piece of furniture. It's very odd, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Really odd.
Yeah.
And when you talk about it in those terms, what you're really doing is giving that mountain meaning for me in a way that wants me to go and have that experience, which I have to be honest, I've never felt that before. Joanna, do you want to just say something about yourself and your nomadic life, which is gathering pace, but also then maybe just reflect on this issue of the meaning which comes from understanding the stories from people who have inhabited the places that you are having your nomadic life around?
Sure. Thanks for having me today, Harold. Hello, everybody. My name is Joanna Haugen, and I'm the founder of Rooted, which is a solutions platform at the intersection of sustainable tourism, social impact, and storytelling. And this story that Roja has just shared with us is a great example of how colonizer language has really been infused in the travel experience and the tourism industry in general. And the tourism industry is held up and has been modeled around a number of what I would call myths that we need to bust in this space. And one of them is that travel is a very sanitized and comfortable experience. And that experience has really been shaped around the white colonial gaze. And it really is by empowering and amplifying and supporting and promoting local storytellers that we're able to finally hear these stories that have history and cultural context. And I think it's really important that we start inviting these stories into travel spaces. I think for a long time, we've been kind of avoiding these real stories, these actually authentic stories, because they are complex, they are complicated. If we're going to talk about the local language for and around Table Mountain, as it is known in the colonial context, then that also requires that we grapple with the complex and messy and dark history that comes with that. And I think for far too long, we have helped travelers be comfortable in these spaces. We don't want to complicate things. We don't want them to feel uncomfortable with all these complex aspects of the culture and history that have helped shape the destination. But if we're going to support local tourism and local communities through the tourism vehicle, then we have to be willing to grapple with and complicate the narrative, as I like to say. And quite frankly, I think a growing number of travelers want that experience. And if they are out for just that simple sanitized experience, this isn't about the traveler necessarily. We need to center the local people, the local culture, the local community. And that means inviting in these local stories, this language, and the local storytellers that are telling these stories.
Joanna, there's another side to this, I think. I mean, if I go to Cape Town and I only hear a portion of the history of Cape Town and of the Cape, or if I go up Table Mountain and I only hear one interpretation of the history and the meaning of the place, in a way I'm being shortchanged, aren't I? If I'm wanting to experience the place and to understand the place, surely I'm entitled as a traveler to expect that the industry will deliver to me a richer understanding of the place I'm visiting. Or am I just being naive in thinking that the industry ought to do that?
I think that the industry needs to build its story with intention around real stories. And so that is on the destinations, that is on tour operators. I don't know that all travelers know that there is that story, especially when you're talking about travelers who are coming from Western, more privileged countries. The history and the story they've been told their whole lives growing up has been shaped through this colonial lens. And so when they travel, that's the story they expect to hear. And so it is on the tourism industry to introduce those stories to the traveler. I don't think all travelers know to even ask those questions. And so we need to make those stories available. We may need to make them make it loud and clear that this is the story. This is the historical and cultural context upon which a destination has been shaped, and we need to be supporting the local community that is telling this story. So absolutely, travelers have that right, but I don't know that all travelers even know to ask for it. So it really is up to the tourism industry to reshape that narrative so that that is the norm.
I think there's also a responsibility on the travelers to ask the questions. I mean, at the heart of the idea of responsible tourism is about the concept that you're actually going to live and share in somebody else's place for a short period of time, and that you ought, while you're there, perhaps to learn something about that place. You're never going to learn all of it, but I mean, clearly the history of the place and the names of the parts of the place are an important part of sharing that history and that understanding of what the place means. Dirk, can we come to you? Do you want to just say something about where you are and how your community, the community that you work with, how they see tourism? Because I have to say, Dirk, I'm deeply embarrassed that I've obviously been very close to where your community is, because I've been up to Klaus Lodge and I've had the most wonderful experience there of meeting with some of the Kamani San. And, you know, unforgettable part of my experience, but I'm very sad that I missed you. Anyway, tell us something about your community and how they see these strange people who come to visit them as tourists.
Thank you, Harold. And yes, I'm Dirk Pina, and I'm the tourism officer for the Kamani San for the last 11 years. And I wanted to put you on the spot because of something that you mentioned earlier. And now you've mentioned it yourself, that you've passed through our village and you went to the national park where Klaus Lodge was situated. And you happened to just experience a glimpse of the cultural heritage of my community and happened to see some of my community members. So I just wanted to emphasize on what Joanne had said in terms of the narrative and the way traditional marketing and offerings come from different countries in terms of cultural tourism or experience cultural, especially cultural nature-based tourism. So the narrative is put out there and there is something missing. It's the real story behind it. Because if that material included in your itinerary, that where you are heading to the Khalkhadi, you are going to pass the nation that originated from this area, and you're going to go to Klaus Lodge, where some of these Komani San also happen to have a small village, but you can experience the best of both. So yes, we need to crack that boundary of having everything very perfectly planned and very perfectly itinerated for visitors. We need to have in there the story behind how this was actually packaged together. And this will open up for the person that's using the itinerary or opt to buy it to understand that I actually have much more options. That's what's put forward to me. And just to get back to you, that's exactly the tone of my community. For my community, it's critically important that when someone visits the community, we call it the long lost family coming home, because we kind of feel that we connect with absolutely everyone and anyone that's part of the ecosystem. So for us, it's not just sitting in the bus and taking pictures. It's really about getting off and really about participating and engaging with one another. Well, under the current circumstances of COVID-19, it's a completely different scenario. And that's definitely something that we as a community have to reconsider or rethink. But it is very important that you have to know that there's different elements of a real experience that needs to be embraced and it needs to be tapped in. It's very important.
We'll come back to the COVID issue towards the end of this. We will spend some time on it, Dirk. It's clearly very important. What I'd like to do now is really get your advice in the context of what Keith Henry said, who's a Métis Indian from Canada, North America. He said it in the previous panel that people will have heard shortly before this one. When he made the point, I think it's a really fundamental point for the industry to remember, that if it's about us, it must be with us. That fundamental principle that if you want to talk about us, then it's for us to do that talking. There must be other rules that you can think of that the industry should abide by in terms of the way in which storytelling is used in the tourism industry. But if I could start maybe this time with you, Joanna, and then I'll come to Roja, and then back to you, Dirk. What do you think are the golden rules, Joanna, that people should abide by? And you don't all have to agree, by the way. Be quite happy if you to disagree with each other. Joanna.
Well, I think one of the key things that we need to remember about storytelling is that it really is a heart-centered experience. And so I think we get really caught up with facts and figures and data when it comes to stories. And one of the key things that we need to remember about stories is that we are all human and that we have shared values that that we can connect over. And so finding those shared values is, I think, a key part of helping people connect with each other through storytelling in the tourism context. I also think that we need to, and I alluded to this before, we need to be willing to complicate the narrative. And we have done a really fantastic job in the tourism industry with talking about challenging topics and challenging issues, whether that is the climate emergency or gentrification in urban areas or commoditization of indigenous cultures. I mean, it runs the gamut of the issues that tourism has helped accelerate. But we don't like to talk about these things. We stuff them in the dark corners of our communities and we just don't go there. And I think that tourism and the travel experience is the perfect opportunity to complicate the narrative and grapple with those complicated stories. I think this too is an opportunity to use those shared values and connect with travelers about commonalities that we have regardless of where we're living in the world, to talk about those challenges and to surface local solutions and change makers and initiatives and local businesses that are addressing these kinds of problems. Because these are universal problems, they all have a local flavor to them. But regardless of what those problems are, I think that we should start talking about them through the tourism vehicle. And so those are two key rules that I would say are key to
You want to just repeat those,
story.
Joan, can you just repeat those two key rules so that everybody gets them?
Yeah, sure. First, don't rely on facts, figures, and data. Remember that it's a heart-centered activity. And two, complicate the narrative and be willing to grapple with complicated stories in the tourism context.
So don't take the conflict out of the history.
Totally. Yep.
How does that sound to you, Taraha? Taraha, you're muted.
Yeah, okay. No, I want to say, I totally agree with Joanna. I think that the term of complicating the narrative and complicating the narrative also just means that there needs to be a sense that when tourists come to this place that's now no longer called Cape, they need to be sort of informed that there was a genocide that happened over 300 years, that there were people who came to this land who found the most humane people, and that we were dehumanized for 300 years to the point where today we don't even remember who we were. We don't even remember our ancestral tongues. We are living a life like many First Nation communities in extreme poverty. And complicating the narrative, then for me, it's about acknowledging the evils that created this place that everybody today talks about, Cape Town, and it's got Camps Bay and Blouberg. And nowhere will we read that place, Camps Bay or Blouberg, or if it's called Greenpoint, that there were Khoikhoi people that were removed violently from those lands, that our ancestors were forced off the land. And I think the challenge with a lot of institutions in South Africa is that there's this absolute intentional desire to not engage, that they want to sell Cape Town as this beautiful mother city, and yet you can't sell that city in isolation. You can't pretend that this beautiful colonial city that people in Germany and France and England come to was not as a result of a lot of pain. Our people, my people, were put through extreme pain. And I think there's, again, there's also a lot of people that are open to those narratives now. I think there needs to be the systemic openness from institutions in South Africa, South African tourism, Cape Town tourism, that they need to be open to realize that our consumers who come to South Africa to appreciate the land, they want these stories. They want to understand why Quick Cape is no longer is now called Cape Town. They want to go to the Eastern Cape, and when they go to Tsitsikamma, Tsitsikamma is one of the biggest parks. Tsitsikamma, you ask people, many people don't even know that it also Tsitsikamma, the Tsi in that term means and the Kama comes from Kama. And when you go there, there's a lot of water. So the openness and the willingness to engage with these really hard, painful stories, that's important, but also the humility. I think that the humility comes in when you realize that there are people outside of your spaces who might know more about their own ancestral territory than you do. And I think when our agencies become humble in that, realizing that not everybody knows everything, that is then where we get to the point where nothing about us without us. Because if you are driven by the sense that you know everything, you are going to not engage with the communities on the grassroots levels. So it is about, and again, maybe this term decolonizing is overused, but it is about recognizing that that colonial lens that you use to write about tourism for maybe colonial tourists, that also needs to be pulled apart so we can really speak to these stories honestly, critically, while still having people appreciate, you know, the beauty of our places.
Are the younger people in your community, Turaho, are they learning this history, or has it been lost from their learning? I know there's been a lot of work done to try and spread knowledge of the history of the various movements around Southern Africa. But is that history now being taught to the next generation?
You know, it's we've literally, so South Africa had 27 years of democracy, and sadly, Khoikhoi communities were never really part of. So there was this narrative that was going to be sold to South Africa about African people, and those African people were never going to be. We were never Khoikhoi people. It was always mostly going to be a Zulu or Xhosa or Tswana people. And I think what's happening now is slowly there's a whole country that's waking up to the realization that, listen here, there are these first voices that are missing. There are this language like Khoikhoi that's not part of the landscape. And I think that is amazing. And I think we often have this discussion. We literally say that our Abu Khan, our ancestors, they've literally been silenced on our land for 300 years by colonizers and all their activities, but they've waited for a generation to emerge that's going to kaima. Kaima in Khoikhoi means to stand up. And so what's happening now is that suddenly, you know, there's this, I think it's unbelievable that suddenly there are these people from all groups that are now wanting to know these stories that are open. So it might not still be formalized. We are still fighting for Khoikhoi to be introduced at schools, you know, and in early childhood centers. We still want it to be acknowledged. But there's this amazing, it's literally like the voices of our Abu Khana ancestors are literally blowing through this land, and they are saying that, listen here, we've been silenced and erased for too long. And coming back to storytelling, it is those voices that really brings a people together. I think when you silence the origin stories, you are silencing people who can bring people together. And so those stories are slowly coming out, and people are so open. And I want to say that we are going to be launching our first Khoikhoi reader and for South Africa in the next 2 weeks. So I'm also just very excited because, again, in the language is the stories of a people, but also the resilience of a people. So yeah, so I'm done.
One of the things that, just give me a second, Dirk, and I'm definitely going to come to you, but one of the things that Joanna said at the beginning of this was that it was about the heart, and another way of expressing that is about looking for the common humanity, perhaps between different ethnic groups around the world. And I mean, to be honest, sometimes it is a struggle to identify that common humanity, depending on what's going on, but it can be a struggle. But as soon as you begin to look for the common humanity, it seems to me you almost inevitably empower the person you're speaking to. Because one of the things that I feel strongly about the guiding and the storytelling process, and it hasn't come up yet, so I want to throw it in, Dirk, and get your response to this, is that I think there's a great similarity between a good guide and a good teacher, in the sense that what the guide has is the opportunity to be an educator. And everything you've just said, Taraha, sounds to me like a teacher. It doesn't sound like somebody taking me round, I don't know, the Kremlin and telling me the weight of the bell and how high the tower is and when it was built. Yeah, it sounds much more like the process of an educator helping people to understand what lies behind the facts of the history, and perhaps revealing that the facts are contested and it's not a simple matter of one story, but of multiple stories. Dirk, is that making sense to you?
Definitely, Howard. Now it's going to be funny again. But I completely agree with you in terms of a guide and a teacher. I think they're actually the same thing. The one just got a certification from a higher institution than the other, but they're doing the exact same job, especially in terms of teaching people on different subjects, as opposed to a teacher that's going to focus on only one subject. And finally, I've just started to studying teaching. That's how passionate I am about it. So generally, my community, the Bushmen or the San people, had the tendency of always avoiding confrontation throughout history. So everything that you will read on San history is the fact that we've been so nomadic and kept on moving. But let me tell you, I actually think as a Bushman myself that we were kind of very much cowards in those time frames, because whenever something was new and we did not understand it, we would move away and carry on how we know, how we do things. So definitely in terms of tourism, I believe that we need to interrupt that, because we as a community ourselves, we wouldn't have been actually moving forward in tourism if we didn't understand that confrontation is needed. And I completely agree with Joanne and with Toroha that these very uncomfortable topics and this very uncomfortable parts of history, it needs to be conveyed to the visitors. They need to really understand the essence of what they've been told, because I believe storytelling is not only embedded in the words, but it's in the expressions of the person. It's in the feelings that the person resonates to you and exude while telling the story, because it makes it, and it should be authentic, and that really speaks to people, and that changed the whole experience. So yes, as part of our history, when you visit the Kalahari, we have to tell you about why we moved all around Africa and how we've been evicted and how we were not only colonized before colonization, we've been moved by different African tribes all the way from Rhodesia, moving all around Cape Town, and eventually ending up in the Kalahari, because nobody thought that the Kalahari were ever going to be a livable area. But we set station here, and even then we got moved, and again forcefully, by conservation development in terms of developing sand parks, etc. And this should be part of sand parks' marketing strategy, to embed the stories of how they've learned that there's a thin line between traditional conservation and formal conservation, and how beautiful that is, and how beautiful that contribute to anti-poaching, because a happy community means a better way of the community to be part of a process of welcoming other people and looking at other means of uplifting the community as a whole. So definitely storytelling is very powerful in different spheres of doing things in different spectrums. And if we can realize that power, we can solve so many problems unknowingly just by telling the story the way it should be told and when it should be told and why it's important to be told.
Do you see, Dirk, do you see in that aspiration, which you and I clearly share, how do you see the certification of guides? And let me put that in a specific context for you. At the original Cape Town conference in 2002, I'd had a fantastic experience in one of the townships, I think it was Langa. And I'd been to the waste recycling centre, and I'd been taken by a group of 3 people from the community to walk down their street. And I was telling a senior government official about that on the floor of the conference. And he immediately said, were they certified guides? And I'm thinking, I have to say, as the tourist, I don't actually care whether it's a certified guide. But of course, in some communities, and I'm not suggesting this is the case in South Africa, but there are places around the world where the guides are certified to make sure that they tell the correct story from the point of view of the government. And that's another problem, isn't it?
Definitely, Howard. And especially with us, we have actually categorized our guides because believe me, especially in the nature-based spectrum of guides, you need to be properly, and it's got to do with safety, you need to be properly accredited. And that takes away so much knowledge and so much raw experience because your traditional guides that grow up in the spaces that doesn't have formal education has so much experience of really letting you experiencing the bush. But because of the certification, they just can't offer you that. So we try to fix that on our side by combining an ultra-traditional guide with a formal guide that's also from the community, but really to let you as a visitor experience the true wealth of the area, because that for us is critically important. We really want you to see a skill that's not learned to certification or to formal schooling, but a skill that's embedded within the person's psyche. And that's really important for people to experience. They really want to know, can a bushman walk right in front of a lion and why? And that's part of the whole learning process. And safety is important. There needs to be someone that really knows how to use rifles and understand the legalities of that. But we shouldn't stop the opportunity of giving authentic experience and including that in the experience.
This might amuse you, Dirk, but we have the same problem in the small town I live in. I run the local civic society, and we have some of our own guides who we've trained. And then you get people come in with their official tourism badges and their blue badge guides, as they're called. What is interesting about that is that you can see the extra pleasure that the tourists get, the visitors, when they're walking around with someone who actually says hello to other residents and engages them in conversation, and is part of, you feel much more that you're visiting the community in that sense than you do if you're visiting with the guide from outside, who probably won't know anybody at all in the town. And in a way, the tourist is getting a better experience, aren't they, when they're being shown around by someone who clearly lives there, knows people, is so aware of the detail of the environment that you're visiting. And that must surely be the sense I would have if I visited your community with you, that I wouldn't have if I was being shown around by someone else who maybe has got all the certificates, but doesn't have those local connections.
Completely agree with you again, Howard. And we have really gone a long way. I think in a specific province in South Africa, they've really grown with understanding this phenomenon because we have a specific way of doing it, and we developed, or in relation with the Northern Cape Tourism Authority in the Northern Cape, we've developed route systems. So if you drive from Cape Town, for instance, you will see the very small niche boards of this is the Kokerboom food and wine route, because this means for a formal guide of Cape Town that, hey, we actually got local specialists that knows about the winery here, that knows about the places to visit. And as you travel throughout the Northern Cape, you will see this very nice signs, and you will even be advised at attractions that we know you have a good guide, but actually we have Hermanus, and Hermanus knows this place like the palm of his hand. And that's exactly what visitors want. They really want to hear from the true source, because they do understand the guide that's with them is just the chaperone. I mean, I've been doing chaperoning, and I completely understand. If I'm in Canada and I visit the Star Lunation, I can't tell that story, not as well as someone from the Star Lunation.
But of course, what Keith Henry is saying is that actually you shouldn't. That you should not colonize other people's stories by telling them on their behalf.
Yeah. No, it's definitely true. If it's about us, why shouldn't it be us?
It's a profound question that Keith asks, and I think it's one that the industry needs to ask itself. Can we come back to the issue that you raised, Dirk? So I'm going to start with you, if I may. The issue of COVID and the difference that that's made. We know that around the world, there are many, many destinations now desperate to see the tourists come back. But there are risks in that. Do you want to perhaps explain how you see that from the point of view of you as a tour guide and on behalf of your community?
Howard, it's definitely a very tricky one, because especially the tourism industry has suffered immensely with the COVID breakdown, and it's still suffering, and it's going to take a long time to recuperate. So the push from tourism institutions is going to be to open up, and to open up fast to make this happen, and to try and make it work as the same oiled machine that it worked like in the past. But there's bad news. It's not going to be good on especially the community tourism base, because that is going to have a huge and it's going to have a ripple effect on community-based tourism, because we need to understand vaccinations alone, the rollout of that is going to take time. And we need to understand the privileged few is going to get hold of vaccination first. These communities is going to be completely pushed to the back. So responsible tourism needs to play a very huge role here, because it's going to become very, very critically important to keep on being responsible and to protect small communities like mine, because COVID, although vaccinations is taking place now, it's going in a positive direction, but we don't want COVID to reach to places like ours, which is aware about it, but haven't experienced any COVID cases. And we would like to keep it that way. We all understand in the perspective of income, it's critically important for livelihoods, but we need to really understand that we need to be very responsible by reintroducing tourism, and make sure that we do not let small communities like ours fall into the stepfall of trying to push this too hard.
Dirk, can I just push you a little bit on this, because I'm not sure that people who don't know where you live will realize how significant what you've just said is. I mean, you're living essentially in a desert. It's not completely without any vegetation, but it is a serious desert. And you were saying earlier, as we were talking, that the temperature gets up how high in the Kalahari?
Yeah.
It gets, you said 50 degrees?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is a very difficult environment to live in, isn't it? Yeah. And tourism is incredibly important, I imagine, to your community for the revenues it brings. I would assume probably far more important than it is in a place like Langa, where there are other ways of making a living around Cape Town. So what you're saying is incredibly significant, I think, because of the scale of the sacrifice that means in economic terms for your community. Yeah, I just want everybody watching this video to realize the depth and strength of what you've just said, because I think it's easy to forget, if you've not been there, just how hostile the environment you now live in is.
Yeah, as I explained, there's been absolutely no cases within the community, but the effects of COVID as a pandemic has been huge, especially because tourism consists of 80% of the economic driver in this area. So with the outbreak of COVID, that completely stopped. And we had to look at very small alternative ways to get just the community ball rolling and to let the community understand the importance of keeping safe and remaining vigilant and just holding out there. So we do understand that it's important to bring tourism back. We want tourism to be introduced in a very responsible manner.
But what's also interesting, it's a compliment in a way to just finish this conversation, but you know, I listen to a lot of people in tourism in my own country and in Europe who are just quite blasé about how easy it's going to be to restart tourism. And I share your concerns, Dirk. I don't think it's going to be easy at all. Taraha, how do you see it from where you are down in the Cape, where it's not quite as hot as it is up in the Kalahari, not quite as hostile an environment? Do you want to switch your microphone on and come back on this?
No, I think COVID has obviously affected. I personally lost. We were going to do a documentary film with an elder Khoi woman, and she's been living in Paarl, which is on the Winelands for close on 60 years, and she was in her late 70s, and she was, for the last 10 years, she's told us about where our Khoi people were buried, you know, where they were murdered and they were buried, and she knows the landscape. But one thing that she wanted to share with us was the making of this jam. There's a specific fig jam, and she knows how to make that. And I remember this one time she said, Denver, we must come when there's enough figs, and then we're going to make the jam, and you must bring the camera, and we do a little documentary film, because our children and our grandchildren aren't interested in the jam. And she wanted me to just record that. And with COVID, I think it was a month ago, where suddenly I heard Omata was in the hospital, and then 2 weeks after she passed away. And for me, I will probably go through this life regretting that we didn't really push the making of that short docu, just to share her making the jam. And what was also so sad about the jam is that the last time I saw her, she gave me a jar of that jam. And I remember eating the jam, and I'm like thinking, I don't think I should eat this jam. I don't want to finish this jam, because I just remember that I will never hear her talk about how she made this jam. And so that is for me, it will be one of, because I know that jam had a story. It was her story. It was passed on for many generations. And so for me, that was like, when I finished that jam, I that day I was just so depressed. I was like, the jam is gone. Omata is gone. Nobody will ever now speak to the jam. So COVID has, again, in the Western Cape, it has affected us, and our people have passed on. I think when we talk about storytelling, the saddest thing though, that because our Khoi people are just lumped into this colored group, that there was no real discussion as to how genetically we are different to white people, that will be affected differently through COVID. Bantu people have a different genetics. There was no stories that mentioned that in 1713, when white people came to the Cape, they brought the smallpox that really killed thousands of our Khoi ancestors. There was no connection that our immune system is different. And so that for me was the scariest part, and it still is the scariest part, because it means that the medication, we will now just be given vaccines that might do more harm than good, because there's no recognition that our genetics are not the same as other groups. And I think Dirk can maybe also agree that it's something that is deeply problematic in South Africa, that no consciousness around the genetics of people, that you can't just give one drug to another group without recognizing that, listen here, it might affect us differently. So we are hoping, we've been using our koi goed so one thing I've encouraged my people is there's this medicine called koi goed. Dirk, ken jy koi goed? It's a sage, and so basically it's a bossy that you burn. And so because we believe, or I believe, that COVID it's something that you breathe in the air, and partly I also believe it's disease is negative energy. And so what we encourage people then to do is to say that you burn the koi goed, that whenever you go out and you come back in your home, burn as much of that, because that was part of our ancestral stories of using medicine in nature to clean our spaces. And yeah, so for me, COVID has affected us, and to not have Omata around to tell me the story of the jam, I am, that for me is just sad. But like Dirk said, the fact that we are not even acknowledged here as people with a different genetic makeup, that puts us at a higher risk, and the fact that it's not spoken about, it's just problematic.
So Raha, what you're saying, whether it's true about the vaccine or not, is not for us to discuss, I think. But I mean, the point you're making is right, isn't it? That actually the cultural frame of reference in which we all operate has to recognise the complexity. And it's similarly an issue in my society. Different groups have responded differently to the to COVID and to the vaccine, and we're seeing that in America and many societies. And we do need to recognise that we live in a complex world, and that people need to be talked to within different cultural frames of reference. Joanna, do you want to comment on the general points about COVID and our understanding of that in terms of what responsible travel requires?
Sure. First, I just thank you for sharing your story about your colleague and friend who has passed. That was it's been a very difficult time, and I think that you bring up a really good point about the fact that in general, the narrative that we hear in this world, whether it's about COVID or anything else, is overwhelmingly shaped by Western media and higher income countries. And as a result, we have lost touch with generations of stories and generations of knowledge and indigenous and native perspectives that are very empowering and can help us through this time. And as we talk about responsible tourism, this word regeneration keeps coming up, and I think that if we're going to embrace this idea of regeneration, we really do need to be in touch with those local and native stories. And to that point, I think that regarding tourism and reopening borders and vaccinations and COVID, one of the primary narratives that I keep hearing from, some of these larger international tourism bodies really is, we need to start tourism, we need to start tourism. And it is coming from that dominant narrative, which is telling travelers, once you've got your vaccination, you're ready to go. And one of the things that has happened over the past year in the tourism industry is this conversation about how we feel it's important to give ownership and agency to local communities and local people. And if that's the case, then this is the wrong narrative for us to be using, because when we tell travelers we need you in order to save the tourism industry, we are centering the story on the traveler instead of centering the story on the local communities that should be powering the tourism industry. And my concern is that we're going to fall back into a white saviorism complex where the story is that you, traveler, are going to save tourism, and our future and local communities will thrive because you have arrived to save the day. And that is a really dangerous narrative. It is something that has shaped the tourism industry for many, many years. And it's something that we say we want to change. And yet we go out and tell this story and tell travelers, hey, once you've got that vaccine, you're ready to go. And so I really think that we need to be listening to local communities like Dirk's, who say, yes, we acknowledge how important tourism is, and we are excited to welcome you back when it is safe and when we, the community, are ready to have you in our space, in our neighborhood. And that needs to be happening from the bottom up and not from the top down. And so I do worry about this narrative and this dominant saviorism narrative that we currently are hearing in the tourism space in regard to COVID.
Well, we're certainly particularly hearing it in the international originating markets. But if you take the South African experience, as I understand it, Dirk and Taraha, the current situation is that what tourism is happening in South Africa is predominantly from within South Africa. It's primarily domestic tourism, and that many people, and I think this is one of the positives, is that many people are discovering parts of their own country which they were unaware of as they have been attracted to go. I know, for example, that Klaus Lodge has had far more South African visitors this year than has traditionally been the case. And it must surely be good news that people are experiencing their own place. Certainly in the UK, lots of people who would have gone abroad are now discovering other parts of their own country. So again, it's a complicated picture, isn't it? As we come to the end of this, I think what I'd quite like to do is just quickly go around all three of you again and just ask you perhaps to sum up what your view is about the role of storytelling in tourism, what you think makes for a really good storytelling experience and what doesn't. And perhaps Dirk and Taraha in particular, to address the question of whether we should expect the guide or the educator who's taking us around to be in both your cases. Should we be disappointed when we see them with a mobile phone, and perhaps disappointed when they're not wearing a loincloth?
Absolutely not. Thank you, Howard. Now, for the last 10 years, I have worked very hard to change the imaginary bushman that has been created by the Western world, us running around in loincloths and shooting bow and arrows. If you come to my house, it will be very simplistic, very open air. It's not ultra modern, but it's still in the bushman setting. And that's what we're communicating. We're communicating the real bushman life today. We tell you the stories of yesterday. We introduce you to community members that prefer to still want to live ultra traditional. We let you understand the true essence of who we are. We're not going to hide it. We're going to explain to you that Dirk works in the office, Dirk knows electricity, Dirk's got a smartphone. We're going to tell you that the Opa that's sitting there is about 70, 80 years old. He tells marvelous stories of the history of the Kuruman River. So if we go to the Kuruman River, let's get him to join us. And he can tell you that story from his perspective, never been taught by a teacher like me. He's going to tell it to you the way he's experiencing it as a child and the way that he thinks it's going to behave now in this changed world from his perspective. So that when you go back, you really need to understand that you have relived the Kalahari through our eyes, but you have also left something with us. You have taught us also something about you. And that's why storytelling is important, because there needs to be a space for you as the visitor to say, oh yes, you guys bury without a trace, but in Canada, we got the totem. Sorry, Taroha. It's the totems that you've seen. So we got the totems, and that's how we used to bury traditionally. Ethnical way, and that's been changed with colonialism, or it has been changed because something else happened in our history. It needs to be an organic way of stories fitting in by exchanging with one another willingly, because really it's, yes, Howard.
So absolutely, and I'm going to come to Taraha, but it seems to me the other thing that we too often forget is that cultures evolve. And you've just illustrated that very beautifully. And I want to just remind people that we should not expect the culture to stick 100 years ago without the mobile phone and without electricity for the benefit of the tourist. Yeah,
Yes.
cultures must continue to evolve, and that in evolving, they will subtly change. But Taraha, just briefly, what's your final take on this before we go to Joanna and wrap up?
Yeah, for me, if I just look at the context of Cape Town, I think what's really important is that there needs to be a sense of openness with our institutions, our entities that does the tourism work, that there needs to be also a humility, that there are people that are not in these spaces who do know a lot about this land, that can share those stories, but also they need to be open to understanding First Nation narratives. I think that is where we are at now, that because when people now even come to Cape Town Airport, there at least needs to be a board that says that means welcome to Cape Town. Then when they go to Table Mountain, there needs to be Urikwaga on that mountain. Simple things with a brochure that's handed out. When the tour guides speak, they need to at least say Tavedes. That means greetings, Tavedes. And I think we find ourselves, especially in Cape Town, that is often considered the most colonial city of all African cities, where there is this deliberate need to market Cape or Cape Town to a colonial visitor, and so the narrative is so framed that it sort of doesn't want to offend or speak to the complexities. As Joanna said, it refuses to complicate the narrative. And I think that is Cape Town tourism and South African tourism shooting themselves in the foot, because there are people that want to come to Urikwaga or Table Mountain, and they want to hear that story. They want to engage with the flowers and hear the names of the flowers on Urikwaga or Table Mountain in the Khoikhoi name. And so there needs to be, again, that openness and recognizing of the fact that complicating the narrative is not necessarily a bad thing for tourism. It is actually a value add and can actually add so much more to tourism and how we and increase the market also, because people want to hear these stories, but there needs to be this openness to engage.
Thanks very much, Taraha. So, Joanne, you're going to have the last. Joanne, you're going to have the last word, but please be quite brief.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I just wanted to make a quick comment on what Dirk has mentioned, and that's this idea of authenticity. And I know a lot of travelers today are out there looking for the authentic experience. And I would just say that it's really important that travelers do not get to define an extractive experience, and authenticity needs to be defined and told from the local community. And so it's really up to the tourism industry to be very clear with travelers that this experience is focused on the local people and local communities, and it is not to be defined, and authenticity is not to be defined by their desires to shape a story that isn't theirs to tell.
Thanks very much, Joanna, and thank you, all of you. Thanks, Taraha, thank you, Dirk, and thank you, Joanna. I think we've said some provocative things this afternoon. It'll be interesting to see what sort of response we get when people begin to look at this video. But thanks very much for your time. Really